The wolf was dying, and Grace Miller had 10 seconds to decide. Blood darkened the snow around him in a wide circle, black in the moonlight, and the wind carried the sound of hunting horns from somewhere beyond the ridge. Whoever had done this to him was still out there, and they were coming back to finish the job. Grace should have run. Every rule she had ever learned in her old pack screamed at her to run. A lone woman living at the edge of the black pine forest did not touch a strange wolf. She did not kneel in the snow beside a creature twice her size. She did not press her bare hands against a wound to slow the bleeding, while her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She did all three. The wolf was enormous, larger than any she had ever seen, with a coat as black as a starless sky. His breathing came in shallow, broken pulls. When she touched him, one golden eye opened and fixed on her with such fierce awareness that she nearly fell backward. That was not the look of a dying animal. That was the look of someone measuring her, deciding whether she was a threat. The horn sounded again, closer now. She could not carry him. He had to weigh 3 times what she did. But her sled, the one she used to haul firewood, was leaning against a pine not 20 steps away, because she had been cutting deadfall when she heard the first cry echo through the trees. Fate, her mother would have called it. Foolishness, her father would have said. Both of them were gone now, so the choice was hers alone. Grace dragged the sled through the snow, dropped to her knees, and looked the wolf in the eye. "I am going to help you," she said quietly. "If you bite me, we both die out here, so do not bite me." Something shifted in that golden gaze. She would have sworn, later, that it was surprise. Getting him onto the sled nearly broke her. He tried to help, she realized. Even torn open and half frozen, he pushed with his back legs when she pulled, and when he finally collapsed onto the wooden boards, a low sound rumbled out of him that was not a growl. It was almost a thank you. The horns were close enough now that she could hear voices beneath them. Rough voices, laughing voices, the kind that enjoyed what they were doing. Grace grabbed the rope, leaned her whole body into it, and pulled. The half-mile back to her cabin was the longest journey of her life. Her boots slipped. The rope burned lines into her palms through her gloves. Twice she heard branches snap behind her and froze, certain a hunter had found her tracks. But it was only the forest shedding its weight of snow. The wolf lay silent on the sled, his eyes closed now, and every time she glanced back, she was terrified she would find him gone. Her cabin sat in a hollow between 2 hills, half hidden by old pines, with smoke rising thin from the chimney. Her grandmother had built it long ago, back when the borderlands were still considered part of the kingdom, instead of a forgotten edge, where exiles and rogues were dumped and left to survive. Grace had lived there alone for 3 years, ever since the night her pack was destroyed, and she became a girl, with no name worth speaking, no protection, and no future. She hauled the sled through the door, and it took the last of her strength to roll the wolf onto the blankets she kept by the fire. Then she saw the wounds properly, and her breath caught. These were not the marks of another wolf. These were blade wounds, long and precise, and the edges of the torn flesh had a strange gray tint she recognized from her mother's oldest warnings. Silver. Someone had cut this wolf with silver weapons, which meant they had not been hunting an animal at all. They had been trying to execute one of her own kind. Grace sat back on her heels, cold spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the winter. A shifter. She had dragged a wounded shifter into her home, and shifters who got hunted with silver were either criminals with prices on their heads or enemies of someone very powerful. Either way, the smart thing was to drag the sled right back out into the snow. The wolf's breathing hitched, his paws twitched, and Grace, who had watched her whole family die because no one came to help them, reached for her mother's medicine box instead. She worked through the night. She cleaned the wounds with boiled water and the bitter herb paste her mother had taught her to make, the one that drew silver poisoning out of blood. She stitched what she could with trembling fingers. She kept the fire high and covered him with every blanket she owned, and when his body shook with fever in the smallest hours, she sat beside him and talked, because her mother had always said, "A sick body listens even when the mind sleeps." She told him about the forest, about the fox who stole from her woodshed, about how the northern lights had come early this year, green rivers across the sky. She did not tell him about the night her pack burned, because some stories she never told anyone, not even a dying wolf who could not answer. Near dawn, she finally slept, slumped against the wall with her hand, resting on the blankets near his shoulder. She woke to sunlight, silence, and the certain feeling of being watched. Grace opened her eyes slowly. The blankets by the fire were empty. A man sat in the chair by her window. He was wrapped in one of her blankets, and beneath it, she could see the bandages she had wound around a wolf's body, now stretched across a man's chest. He was tall, she could tell even seated, with black hair falling across a face that seemed carved from something harder than ordinary flesh. Old scars marked his shoulder and the line of his jaw, but it was his eyes that stopped her heart for a full beat. Golden. The same fierce, measuring gold that had looked up at her from the snow. Neither of them moved. The fire crackled. Outside, a bird called once, and went quiet, as if even the forest was holding its breath. "You should not have helped me," the man said at last. His voice was low and rough, like stone dragged over stone, and there was something in it Grace could not name. Not anger. Something more careful than anger. "You are welcome," she answered, because fear made her reckless, and she had decided 3 years ago that she was done letting fear choose her words. Something flickered across his face. It might have been the ghost of a smile, gone before it could live. "Do you know what I am?" he asked. "A shifter someone tried to kill with silver," Grace said. "Which means you are either dangerous or unlucky. Possibly both. And you still dragged me through half a mile of snow. You were dying." She lifted her chin. "Where I come from, that used to mean something." He studied her for a long moment, and she had the strange sense that no one had spoken to him this way in a very long time, and that he could not decide whether it offended him or fascinated him. "Kale," he said finally. "My name is Kale. I am a rogue. There was trouble between packs in the south, and I ended up on the wrong side of it. That is all you need to know." It was a lie. Grace knew it the moment the words left his mouth, the way she always knew when the sky was about to turn. Rogues did not carry themselves like that, straight-backed and steady-eyed even while wrapped in a borrowed blanket. Rogues did not get hunted through the winter forest by men with silver blades and hunting horns, and rogues certainly did not have a strange dark mark burned into the skin over their heart, half hidden by bandages, in a shape that tugged at some old memory she could not quite reach. But Grace had her own secrets, and she understood the value of letting people keep theirs. "Grace," she said. "Grace Miller. You are in the borderlands, at the edge of the black pine forest, and you are not going anywhere, for at least 2 weeks, unless you want those stitches to tear open." 2 weeks. He said it the way other people said impossible. 2 weeks, she repeated, and stood to put water on the fire. "Unless you would rather explain to the next patrol of hunters why you are crawling through the snow leaving a trail behind you." His jaw tightened. In the daylight she could see how exhausted he truly was, the gray tinge still lingering at the edges of his skin where the silver had touched his blood. He was holding himself upright through sheer will, and even that was beginning to fail. Then he asked the question she had been waiting for, the one everyone eventually asked. "Why do you live out here alone?" Grace kept her eyes on the kettle. "Because everyone I belonged to is gone," she said, "and the world decided I was not worth keeping." Silence stretched behind her. When she finally turned around, Kale was watching her with an expression she had never seen aimed at herself before. Not pity. She would have hated pity. It was something closer to recognition, as if he had looked at her and seen a wound shaped like his own. "Then the world is a fool," he said quietly. Grace's hands went still on the kettle. Far to the south, in a stone fortress she had never seen, men in fine cloaks were toasting the death of a king they believed they had left bleeding in the snow. They were dividing his territories on maps and drinking to a new age. They had no idea that the most feared alpha in 7 kingdoms was sitting in a one-room cabin in the borderlands, wrapped in a patched blanket, watching a lonely woman make tea, and feeling, for the first time in 20 years, something dangerously close to peace. And Grace had no idea that by saving one dying wolf, she had just stepped into the center of a war. The kettle began to sing. Outside, fresh snow started to fall, covering the sled tracks, covering the blood, covering every trace of the night. Everything changed. 2 weeks, Kale said again, softer this time, as if testing the shape of the words. Then, so quietly she almost missed it, he added something that sounded like, "That might be enough." "Enough for what?" she asked. But he only closed his eyes and leaned back in the chair, and Grace, unsettled in a way she could not explain, poured the tea and let the question hang in the warm air between them, unanswered. She would learn the answer soon enough, and when she did, nothing about her quiet life at the edge of the forest would ever be quiet again. 3 days later, Grace caught Cale lying to her for the second time, and this lie nearly got them both discovered. She had gone to the village at the forest's edge to trade dried herbs for flour, leaving strict instructions that he was to stay in bed, stay quiet, and stay away from the windows. She came back to find the woodpile behind her cabin doubled in size, every log split clean, and Cale standing in the yard with an axe in his hand, snow in his hair, and fresh red seeping through the bandage on his side. "I told you not to move," she said. "I did not move far," he answered, as if that settled the matter. "You reopened your stitches." "Barely." Grace set down her basket, walked over, and pulled the axe out of his hand before he could react, which surprised them both, because men like Cale were not used to having things taken from them. "You are the worst patient I have ever had," she informed him, "and I once treated a badger." For one unguarded second, Cale laughed. It was short and rough, as if the sound had rusted from lack of use, but it transformed his whole face, and Grace felt something turn over in her chest that she immediately decided to ignore. That was when they heard the bells. Not church bells, signal bells, ringing from the village, 3 sharp strikes, and then 2, over and over. Grace went pale. That pattern meant strangers, armed strangers, moving through in numbers. "Inside," she ordered, and for once, Cale obeyed. Through the gap in her shutters they watched the road that wound past the far side of the frozen creek. Within the hour, riders appeared. A dozen of them, wearing dark gray cloaks with a red mountain stitched on the shoulder. Grace felt Cale go completely still behind her, and the temperature of the room seemed to drop. "You know that mark," she whispered. "Crane's men," he said. His voice had changed. All the roughness had smoothed into something cold and precise, a blade being drawn slowly. "Victor Crane, he commands the largest army in the South. And what would Southern soldiers want in the borderlands in the middle of winter?" Cale did not answer, which was an answer in itself. The riders stopped at every cabin along the creek. Grace watched them hammer on doors, watched old Ben Hartley from the mill stand shivering in his doorway while they questioned him, watched them hold up something that glinted in the pale sun. When they moved closer, she saw what it was. A drawing on stiff paper, a man's face. "They are searching for someone," she breathed. "They are searching for a body," Cale corrected quietly. "They will not find one, so they are searching for a survivor instead." Grace turned and looked at him, really looked. The bandages, the silver scars, the way he watched the soldiers with the flat patience of a man counting enemies rather than fearing them. The question rose in her throat, the true question, the one that had been growing since the first night. "Who are you, Cale? Who are you really?" The knock on her door shattered the moment. Grace's heart slammed. Cale moved with shocking speed for an injured man, sliding into the narrow space behind her tall cupboard, and Grace grabbed her mixing bowl, dusted flour on her hands and sleeves, and opened the door with the mild, tired face of a woman interrupted while baking. 2 soldiers stood on her step. Behind them, still mounted, sat an officer with a sharp gray beard and eyes like a winter pond, shallow and freezing. "We are looking for a man," the first soldier said, holding up the drawing. "Dark hair, tall, wounded. Have you seen him?" Grace looked at the drawing, and her stomach dropped through the floor. It was Cale. Younger, harder, drawn in careful ink, but him beyond any doubt. And beneath the portrait, printed in heavy letters, was not the word rogue, or criminal, or outlaw. It was a name, and above the name, a single word that stopped her breathing. King. The world tilted. Somehow her face did not move. Somehow her voice came out flat and a little bored, the voice of a borderland woman who had learned that soldiers meant trouble, and boredom was armor. "I have not seen anyone," she said. "Nobody comes out here in winter. That is rather the point of living out here." The officer nudged his horse closer, and his pale eyes moved past her shoulder, taking in the cabin, the fire, the kettle, and on the table, in plain view, 2 cups. Grace saw him see them. Time slowed to syrup. "You live alone?" the officer asked softly. "With my grandmother," Grace said. "She is bedridden. I would invite you in to meet her, but she has the winter fever, the coughing kind." She let her voice brighten with terrible helpfulness. "You are welcome to come in, though, if your men have already had it." It spread so fast in close rooms. The soldiers stepped back. Even the officer's horse seemed to shift away. The winter fever emptied whole garrisons, and every man there knew it. "If you see this man," the officer said, "you will report it. He is extremely dangerous." There was a pause, and then, with a thin smile, he added words that Grace would remember for the rest of her life. "The kingdom has a new protector now. The old order is finished. Anyone who shelters what is left of it will share its fate." They rode on toward the next cabin. Grace closed the door, slid the bolt across, and stood with her forehead against the cold wood until her hands stopped shaking. Then she turned around. Cale had stepped out from behind the cupboard. He stood in the middle of her small cabin, and he was not looking at her the way a rescued rogue looks at his rescuer. He was looking at her the way a general looks at someone who has just done something remarkable under fire. "A bedridden grandmother," he said, "with the coughing fever. My mother always said the best lies are the ones people are afraid to check. Your mother sounds like she was a dangerous woman." "She was a healer," Grace said. "Same thing. Some days." Then she crossed the room, picked up the drawing the soldiers had left nailed to her gatepost, and set it on the table between them, face up, the word king, staring at the ceiling. "2 cups," she said. "That was my mistake. I will not make another one. And you are not going to lie to me again, because I just risked my life for you twice, and I have earned the truth." Cale looked at the drawing for a long time. When he raised his eyes, something in them had changed. The careful stranger was gone, and what remained was older, heavier, and unbearably tired. "If I tell you," he said, "you can never give it back. The truth is not a coin. Once it is in your hand, it stays there. And men like the ones who just left will kill you for carrying it." "They will kill me anyway if they come back and find you," Grace said. "At least let me know what I am dying for." The fire popped, snow slid from the roof with a soft rush, and Cale, who had commanded armies and silenced councils with a glance, found that he could not refuse this stubborn woman with flour on her sleeves. "My name is not Cale," he said. "That was my brother's name. He died young, and I keep it close, so forgive me, because that part was almost true." He straightened, and even wounded, even in borrowed clothes, the whole room seemed to rearrange itself around him. "My name is Adam Blackwood. 8 days ago I ruled the 7 territories as Alpha King. Then the men I trusted most poured poison into my cup, cut me with silver when the poison was too slow, and threw me from the mountain road into the ravine to die. Victor Crane sits on my throne tonight. Everyone I loved believes I am dead." He paused, and his voice dropped low. "Everyone except the traitors, who have just discovered that my body is missing from the ravine, which is why a dozen soldiers are knocking on doors in the middle of a borderland winter." Grace sat down slowly, because her legs had made the decision for her. "The Alpha King," she said faintly. "I fed soup to the Alpha King. I threatened the Alpha King with a wooden spoon when he would not drink his medicine." "You did," Adam agreed, and the ghost of that rusted laugh touched his voice again. "It was the bravest thing I have seen in years." Outside, far down the creek road, the signal bells rang once more as the soldiers finished their sweep and turned south, empty-handed. Inside the small cabin, a fallen king and an exiled healer sat across a rough table from each other, the drawing between them, the fire painting gold across their faces. "Why tell me the truth now?" Grace asked at last. "You could have kept lying. I might never have known." Adam looked at her, and when he answered, he sounded genuinely puzzled by his own words. "Because when that officer looked past you into this room, you did not glance at my hiding place. Not once. Trained spies cannot manage that." He shook his head slowly. "I have spent 20 years surrounded by people who watched me the way you watch a fire in a dry forest. You are the first person in all that time who simply watched the door." So she did what borderland women did when the world became too large. She stood, put the kettle back on, and made tea for a dead king, while the snow erased the soldiers' tracks outside, and neither of them said aloud what both of them now understood. The hunters would be back. And the next time, a story about a sick grandmother would not be enough to save them. The avalanche came without warning, and it changed everything between them. It was the second week, and Adam's wounds had closed enough for short walks. Grace needed winter root, the pale bitter plant that grew under the cliffs an hour north, because her supply of fever medicine was gone and the village children were falling sick. Adam insisted on coming. She insisted he stay. He came anyway, moving beside her through the pines with that silent, watchful grace that no amount of injury seemed to dull. They were beneath the cliffs, Grace on her knees digging through snow for the telltale silver leaves, when Adam suddenly went rigid. "Grace," he said, "run." She heard it then, a deep crack from far above, like the sky splitting, and then a growing roar, as the whole white face of the cliff let go. There was no time to run, there was barely time to breathe. Adam seized her, threw them both toward the shallow cave mouth they had passed 20 steps back, and covered her body with his, as the world came down. The roar swallowed everything. Snow slammed across the cave entrance, punching through in bursts of white powder, and the light died to a dim blue glow. Then, silence. The heavy, pressing silence of being buried. Grace lay still, her face against Adam's chest, his arms locked around her, both their hearts hammering hard enough to feel through winter coats. Slowly, carefully, he lifted his head. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No. You?" The stitches held. He sounded almost surprised. "Your sewing is better than my royal physician's." A wild little laugh escaped her, the kind that comes after fear. "We are buried under half a mountain, and you are reviewing my needlework." The snow wall at the cave mouth glowed faintly with daylight, thick but not endless. They could dig out. It would take hours, and the smart thing was to save warmth and strength, and dig in shifts. So for the first time since he had arrived, they had nothing to do but talk. It began with small things. She told him about the fox who raided her woodshed every autumn, so bold it had once stolen a whole loaf of bread while she watched. He told her about his brother Cale, who had died of fever at 9 years old, and how Adam, 8 and furious at the world, had climbed the palace roof and refused to come down for a full day and night. "Who finally got you down?" Grace asked. "My mother. She did not order me down. She climbed up and sat with me until I was ready." Adam was quiet for a moment. "She died the next winter. After that, no one ever sat with me again. They only ever stood below and shouted instructions." The blue light deepened as the afternoon aged. They took turns digging at the snow wall, and between turns they drifted closer to the deep things, the way people do in the dark. "Tell me about your pack," Adam said at last, gently, the way you would touch a wound. And Grace, who had never told anyone, found herself telling him. "We were small. 30 families along the Alder Creek, 3 days east of here. My father was the healer. My mother taught me plants before I could read." She stared at the snow wall, and her voice went flat and careful. 3 years ago, in the night, armed men came. They wanted our land, or our loyalty, or maybe just to prove they could take whatever they wished. I never learned which. My mother pushed me through the root cellar window and told me to run for the forest and not look back. "Did you look back?" Adam asked softly. "Once." Grace's hands had stopped moving. There was fire in every window. "I ran until my legs gave out, and when I finally returned days later, there was nothing left to bury, and no one left to ask. The kingdom's men came, wrote our village into a ledger as lost to rogue raids, and rode away. Case closed. 30 families, 1 line of ink." The silence in the cave was absolute. "Alder Creek," Adam said. Something had changed in his voice. 3 years ago. Late autumn. Grace turned. "How do you know the season?" "Because I read that report." Adam's jaw was tight, and in the dim blue light his golden eyes burned. "It crossed my desk with 100 others. Rogue raid, total loss, no survivors. I signed it and moved to the next page." He looked at her as if she were a ghost. "No survivors, Grace. That is what my own council told me. That is what I believed." The cave seemed to tilt. Grace heard her own heartbeat in her ears. "Your council," she repeated slowly. "The same council that just tried to end you?" They stared at each other as the same thought arrived in both their minds. A cold key sliding into a cold lock. Adam spoke first, each word deliberate, like a man walking on ice. "Victor Crane's family lands lie 3 days east of here. His holdings doubled in size 3 years ago. He told the council he had purchased abandoned territory. He held up a map at the meeting. I remember it. A creek ran through the middle of the new land." "The Alder Creek," Grace whispered. "I signed the paper," Adam said. His voice cracked, very slightly, in a way she suspected no living person had ever heard. "I closed the file on your family with my own hand, because a traitor put it in front of me and I trusted him. Grace, your pack was not lost to rogues. It was the first move in a game that ended 8 days ago with poison in my cup. Crane has been carving his path to the throne for years, and your family was the first stone he stepped on." Grace could not speak. 3 years of not knowing, 3 years of a wound that had no shape, and now suddenly it had a shape, and a name, and the name was sitting on a stolen throne. She was not aware she was shaking until Adam's hands closed around hers. "I cannot give them back," he said, "and I will not insult you with apologies, because sorrow is cheap, and your family deserves more than cheap. So I will give you the only true thing I have. When I take back what is mine, Crane will stand before an open court and answer for Alder Creek by name. Your family will not remain one line of ink. I swear it on my brother's memory, and I have never broken an oath on his name." Grace looked down at their joined hands, hers small and scarred from herb work, his large and scarred from other things entirely, and something shifted in the space between them, quiet and enormous, like the settling of the snow above. "You should know," she said unsteadily, "that I stopped believing in kings 3 years ago." "Good," Adam said. "I stopped believing in them 8 days ago. Perhaps together we can build something better than a king." They broke through the snow wall just before dark, emerging into a world washed clean and blazing with sunset. The whole forest glittered. Neither of them spoke on the walk home, but they walked closer than they had that morning, their shoulders nearly touching, and when Grace stumbled once in the deep snow, Adam's hand found her arm, before she even began to fall, as if some part of him had already learned to move when she moved. That night, Grace woke long past midnight and found the fire low and Adam's blankets empty. He was standing at the window, watching the northern lights pour green across the sky, and his face in that strange glow was the loneliest thing she had ever seen. "You should sleep," she said quietly. "Kings need rest too. I was remembering what you said in the cave, that you stopped believing in kings." He did not turn around. 20 years I have worn that title, and tonight I realized I only ever heard people speak to the crown, fear it, flatter it, plot against it. You are the only person who has ever ignored it completely, and it turns out that underneath, there was still a man. I had honestly forgotten. Grace came to stand beside him at the window. The green light rippled over the snow like a slow river. "Well," she said, "the man snores less than the wolf did, so I suppose I will keep him a while longer." Adam laughed, the real laugh, unrusted now, and in that small cabin at the frozen edge of a kingdom that believed him dead, the most feared alpha in 7 territories stood shoulder to shoulder with an exiled healer, and felt his broken world quietly begin to reassemble itself around a new center. Neither of them named it. Naming it would make it real, and real things could be taken. But high above them, the lights burned on, and far to the south, in a fortress of stone, Victor Crane received a report that a search of the borderlands had found nothing, dismissed his officers, and then sat alone for a long time, staring at a map, at one small stretch of forest, with the patient unease of a man who has learned exactly how dangerous it is to assume Adam Blackwood is dead. "Search again," he wrote at the bottom of the report, "wider, and this time, question everyone who lives alone." The trap was baited with a child. It was market day in the village, and Grace had gone in for salt and news, leaving Adam splitting wood with strict orders to stay near the cabin. The village square was crowded and strangely quiet, and it took her a moment to understand why. Gray-cloaked soldiers stood at every corner, not the dozen from before, 30 at least, and at the center of the square, on a raised cart, stood the officer, with the winter pond eyes. Beside him, held gently but firmly by the shoulder, stood little Tom Hartley, the miller's grandson, 8 years old, white-faced and trying so hard not to cry. "Good people," the officer called out, his voice carrying easily. "This child was caught this morning carrying fresh bread into the forest. Bread his family did not bake, bound for a person his family does not know." He smiled down at the boy. "Children are honest creatures. He tells me a kind lady with brown hair pays him a copper to leave the basket on the flat stone by the creek fork, for a sick traveler." Grace's blood turned to ice water. She had arranged that with Tom a week ago, extra food, a small kindness for a boy whose family was struggling, a way to build supplies without her own frequent purchases drawing notice. She had thought she was being careful. She had built the evidence against herself with her own hands. Now, the officer continued, we simply need the kind lady with brown hair to step forward and explain her sick traveler. Nothing will happen to her if the story is innocent. His pale eyes drifted across the crowd. But if no one steps forward, I will have to conclude this village is hiding something together, and villages that hide things lose their grain stores until memories improve. In midwinter, every family, starting with this boy's. The square was dead silent. Grace stood 20 feet away in the crowd, hood up, heart slamming. Half the village knew her. Old Ben Hartley knew her. One frightened glance from any of them and it was finished. Nobody glanced at her. That was the thing that nearly broke her composure. These people, who had so little, who owed her nothing but fever medicine and delivered babies, stood like stones. Ben Hartley looked at his own grandson on that cart and kept his face empty as a field in winter. The whole village lied for her without a single word. But the boy, they would take it out on the boy, and then on all of them, and Grace could not breathe around what she knew she had to do. She was one heartbeat from stepping forward when the miller's wife screamed, "Fire! The mill is burning! Fire!" Every head turned. Black smoke was boiling up from the far end of the village, thick and sudden, pouring from the old mill's rear shed. The square dissolved into chaos, buckets, shouting, running feet. The soldiers hesitated, discipline against instinct. And in that hesitation, the crowd surged, and Tom Hartley simply vanished off the cart, swallowed by a dozen deliberate bodies, passed hand to hand, and gone. Grace did not stop to wonder. She ran with the crowd, cut left behind the smithy, and flew up the forest path with her hood down and terror at her heels. She smelled the smoke on him before she reached the cabin. Adam stood at the tree line, breathing hard, a burned smell on his coat, snow melted on his sleeves, and eyes like molten gold. "The mill shed," she gasped. "That was you." "Old flour dust and one lamp," he said, loud, dramatic, and mostly harmless. "The stone mill itself will not burn." He caught her arms, scanning her for injuries. "I was watching from the ridge. I saw the soldiers march in at dawn and I followed. Grace, I saw you in that crowd. I saw your foot move. You were going to give yourself up." They had Tom. "I know." His hands tightened. "And I know that if I had shouted your name to stop you, I would have finished us both, so I burned a shed instead." His voice dropped, and beneath the steel of it, something raw showed through. "Do not ever do that again. Do not trade yourself. Not for me. He is 8 years old, Adam. And you are—" He stopped. The sentence hung there, headless, enormous. Snow drifted down between them. Grace stood very still. "I am what?" she asked quietly. Adam looked at her, and a battle moved through his face, and discipline lost. "You are the reason I want the throne back," he said. "Not pride, not vengeance. All those burned out of me somewhere in that ravine. But a kingdom where a man can erase 30 families with a signature, where an officer can starve a village to catch one woman, where the only safe way to be good is to be invisible. I built that kingdom, Grace. I sat at the top of it and called it order." He shook his head slowly. "Then a woman with a wooden spoon and no reason to love anyone dragged a dying stranger out of the snow, and I have spent every day since learning what my kingdom should have been." The forest was utterly still. Grace's heart was not. "That is a great deal of responsibility for one spoon," she managed. Adam laughed despite everything, and then the laughter faded, and neither of them looked away, and the distance between them, which had been shrinking for weeks in increments too small to name, suddenly closed to nothing. The kiss was soft and brief, and it rearranged the entire world. When they parted, Grace's voice would not quite steady. "We cannot," she began. "We absolutely cannot," Adam agreed. "This is a terrible idea. The worst I have ever heard of." Neither of them stepped back. The sound of hooves on the creek road broke them apart at last. From the cabin's shuttered window they watched a single rider pass at speed, gray cloak flying, heading south. A messenger. By tomorrow, reports would land on desks in the capital. A village that would not talk. A convenient fire. A vanished child. A kind lady with brown hair. "Crane will read between those lines," Adam said grimly. He built his coup on details. "He will send more than soldiers next time. He will send the bloodhound." "Who?" "Marcus Vane, Crane's tracker. He found rebels in the eastern marshes that 3 armies had missed. He does not search buildings, Grace. He reads people. He will walk through that village, look into 10 faces, and know. Then we leave, Grace said. Tonight. Adam turned from the window. And go where? Every road south is watched. The passes are snowed shut until spring. Not the roads. Grace was already pulling her mother's old pack from under the bed, hands moving fast, mind faster. There is a way through the high forest that only healers know, marked tree to tree, the old herb road. It comes out in the western valleys, 3 weeks' walk. My mother took me once. She looked up at him. You said the loyal packs, the ones that would still fight for you, hold the western mountains. The Iron Ridge holds the west, Adam said slowly. The oldest pack. Their alpha, Edward Hale, trained me when I was young. If any soul in this kingdom still believes in me, it is that stubborn old man. Hope and fear fought openly in his face. Grace. That walk in midwinter. Hunted. My strength at half. It will be brutal. Staying is worse. She pushed the pack into his arms and held his gaze. You said you wanted to learn what your kingdom should have been. It starts with this. We do not wait behind walls for permission to survive. Out here, when the storm comes, you move. That night they banked the fire to look slow burning, left the cabin looking lived in, and slipped into the black forest, under a sky boiling with green light. Grace paused once at the tree line and looked back at the only home she had left, small and golden and already lost to her, and felt Adam's hand fold around hers in the dark. I will build you 100 cabins, he said quietly. I only ever needed the one, she answered, but it needed to be safe. Nothing is safe until this is finished. They walked north into the trees and did not look back again. 2 days later, a lean man with colorless eyes stood in the empty cabin, turning slowly in place. Marcus Vane touched the cold kettle, the medicine shelf with its careful gaps, the 2 chairs angled toward each other by the dead fire. He crouched, pressed his palm flat to the floorboards, and closed his eyes, and when he opened them, he was almost smiling. 2 people, he said to the officer waiting in the doorway. One of them injured, healing, powerful. They left in darkness, on foot, north. He stood, brushing dust from his hands. Send word to Lord Crane. His dead king is alive. He is stronger than we feared, and he is not running away. He looked north through the window, toward the white teeth of the far mountains. He is running toward something. On the 9th day of the herb road, Grace began hearing Adam's heartbeat inside her own chest, and she thought the mountain sickness had taken her mind. It started small. She would wake in their snow shelter a breath before he did, every time, as if his rising pulled her up with it. She would feel a sting in her palm and find no wound, then watch Adam absently rub his own hand where a branch had cut him an hour before, out of her sight, around a bend in the trail. On the 9th night, camped in the ruins of an old shrine below the pass, she jolted awake at midnight with her heart pounding in wild fear, and there was nothing wrong at all, until she turned and saw Adam sitting bolt upright 3 feet away, soaked in the aftermath of a nightmare, his fear still ringing through her body like a struck bell. You felt that, he said. It was not a question. I have been feeling things for days, Grace admitted. Your heartbeat, your pain. Just now, your dream. Adam, what is happening to me? Is it the silver? Did the poison somehow pass to me when I treated you? Adam was silent for so long that the fire cracked twice between them. When he finally spoke, his voice was strange, stripped of all its armor. It is not poison. He stared into the flames. Among our oldest bloodlines there is a bond. One soul recognizes another, and the 2 begin to move together. Shared heartbeat first, then shared pain, then feeling, then, in the deepest form, thought. The elders called it the true tie. Most wolves live and die without ever finding it. My parents had it. When my mother died, my father followed within the year, though nothing was wrong with his body. He simply could not remain in a world that had gone silent. Grace felt the ground of her life shift. And you believe that we... She could not finish it. I have known since the avalanche, Adam said quietly. When the cliff came down, I did not decide to reach for you. My body was moving before the sound arrived, because some part of me already lived in you, and felt it first. I have spent every day since pretending otherwise. Why pretend? Because it is a death sentence. The words tore out of him, and the fire flinched in the wind of them. He was on his feet, pacing the shrine's broken floor. Think, Grace. Crane fears one thing, that I am alive. The moment he learns the true tie exists, he will not need to find me at all. He will only need to find you, hurt you, and I feel it across 100 miles. Take you, and I will walk into any trap on earth, and he knows I will, and I know I will, and that is not a weakness in the armor, Grace. That is a door with no lock. Every soul who has ever loved me was made into a weapon against me, or buried before their time. I promised myself in that ravine, if I lived, never again. The mountain wind moaned through the shrine's empty windows. Grace rose slowly and stepped into his path, and he stopped, because he had no choice, because his body would always stop for her. Finished? She asked. Grace. My turn. She took his face in her cold hands. 3 years I lived at the edge of the world, needing no one, feeling nothing, and I called it survival. Then I dragged a dying wolf out of the snow, and every day since, I have felt everything, and it is terrifying, and I would not trade 1 hour of it to go back to being safe and dead inside. So do not stand in a ruined church and tell me love is a door for enemies. My mother pushed me through a window and stayed behind. That is what love costs, and she paid it without blinking. And if you think I am worth less courage than that, then you do not know me at all. Adam looked down at her, and everything in him surrendered at once. The elders say the tie can be refused, he whispered. Both hearts must accept it, or it fades. Do you refuse it? No, he breathed. God help us both. No, neither do I. What happened next, Grace could never fully describe. Warmth poured through the center of her chest, and the last wall between their two pulses dissolved, and for one blinding moment, she was standing in two bodies at once, seeing her own face through golden eyes, feeling 20 years of a king's loneliness collapse into peace. Then it settled, gentled, became simply a second heartbeat under her heartbeat, steady as ground. Oh, she said shakily, laughing and crying at once. Oh, that is much better than mountain sickness. They should have had that night to hold what they had just built. The mountain gave them 1 hour. The howl came from the lower forest, long and cold, a hunting voice, answered by a second, then a third, spread wide in a sweep line. Adam's whole body changed, joy vanishing into steel. Vain, he said. He found the herb road. He is faster than anyone I have ever known. They fled upward in the dark, and now the new bond showed its other face, not weakness, but a weapon no tracker could imagine. Grace felt Adam's instincts as her own. When his ears caught motion on the left flank, her feet were already turning right. When she recognized a healer's mark on a storm-bent tree, he knew it too, without a word. They moved through the black forest like one creature with 4 legs and 2 minds, silent, coordinated, impossible. Twice the sweep line nearly closed on them. The second time, Grace and Adam pressed flat beneath the roots of a fallen giant, while a shape passed so close that snow sifted down onto their shoulders from its footsteps. Grace's terror surged. Adam's calm poured back through the tie, steadying her heart like a hand on the reins. Not yet, that calm said without words. Hold, hold, now move. By first light they had crossed the pass, and the hunting voices had fallen away behind, baffled and furious. Below them, breaking through the last torn clouds, opened a sight that stopped Grace's breath. A vast valley walled in stone, watchtower fires burning along a mountain spine, and above the largest keep, snapping in the dawn wind, a banner, an iron-gray banner with a black wolf. The Iron Ridge, Adam said, and 20 years fell off his voice. Edward Hale still flies the old colors. He never bent the knee to Crane. They descended with the sun, exhausted, half-frozen, alive. But at the valley's border stone, where the trees ended, they walked into a wall of wolves. A dozen sentries, gray-coated mountain giants, materialized out of the rocks with the ease of long practice, encircling them, and a broad old man with a white-scarred face stepped forward with an unsheathed sword and unfriendly eyes. Strangers do not cross the ridge in winter, he rumbled. Name yourselves. Adam pushed back his hood. The old man's sword arm sagged. His face went through disbelief, then fury, then something perilously close to tears, and he mastered all three, and planted the sword point down in the snow. We buried you, Edward Hale said hoarsely. Crane's letter said fever. We held rites. I spoke your funeral words myself, boy, and choked on every one. The words were lies, and the man who wrote them is sitting on my father's throne, Adam said. I have crossed a kingdom on foot, to ask if the Iron Ridge remembers its oaths. The old Alpha's gaze slid to Grace, taking in her healer's pack, her exhaustion, the way she and the fallen king stood angled toward each other like two halves of an arch. His scarred face shifted, and Grace realized he saw it, saw the tie, recognized it, the way old men recognize old truths. The ridge remembers, Edward Hale said at last. He raised his voice, and it rolled off the stones, and every sentry wolf lifted its head. Open the gates, light the deep fires. The king is dead, so says the South. He looked at Adam, and the grim old face split into a wolf smile. The South, he said, is about to be very embarrassed. The traitor inside the Iron Ridge revealed himself on the 5th night, and he did it by pouring Grace a cup of spiced wine. The fortress had transformed in those 5 days. Riders slipped out through hidden passes carrying sealed words to the northern packs, and riders returned carrying answers. The king lives spread through the loyal territories like fire under snow, always one step ahead of Crane's spies, always deniable. Grace watched Adam become someone new in the war room, or rather, someone old. The king reassembled, but changed at the core. He asked questions now. He listened to shepherds as carefully as to captains. When the Iron Ridge elders argued for punishing the border villages that had paid taxes to Crane, Adam refused flatly. They survived, he said. Survival is not treason. I have recently had an education in the difference. Around the table, eyes turned toward Grace, and she pretended great interest in a map. Their evenings belonged to themselves. There was a walled garden behind the keep, buried in snow, and they walked it every night, and the tie between them deepened daily. Words became optional. She would think of a question and watch him smile before she asked it. He would stand in a council session, and she would feel, from 3 rooms away, the exact moment his patience thinned, and somehow tea would arrive. You have turned the Alpha King into a man who receives tea by telepathy, Edward Hale grumbled to her once. In 40 years of war, I have seen nothing so dangerous. But on the 5th night came the wine. His name was Simon Ashford, a smooth-mannered trade envoy who had wintered at the ridge for years, moving goods through the passes, welcomed at every fire. He had a merchant's warmth and a gift for being everywhere. That night, at the long-haul dinner celebrating the Northern Pack's pledge, he appeared at Grace's shoulder, with 2 cups of spiced wine and his easy smile. To the lady who saved the kingdom, he said, pressing a cup into her hand. The ridge speaks of nothing else. Across the hall, deep in conversation with 2 captains, Adam suddenly stopped speaking mid-sentence. Grace felt it through the tie before she understood it. A jolt of pure alarm, not hers. Her hand paused with the cup halfway risen. The smell reached her then, beneath cinnamon and clove, a faint green bitterness that 3 years of her mother's training reached up and seized. Winterbane, a sedative, harmless in a sickroom drop, but this smelled strong enough to drop a horse. Time slowed. Grace looked into Simon Ashford's warm, waiting eyes, and understood everything at once. Not death, sleep. You did not put a lady to sleep in a crowded hall unless men were waiting somewhere in the dark to carry her away quietly, which meant this was not an attack. It was a collection. Crane knew about the tie. Someone inside these walls had told him what Grace was to Adam, and Crane had reached across a kingdom to take the one weapon that mattered. All this passed through her in a single breath, and through the tie, Adam received all of it, her realization arriving in his mind like a written report. Grace smiled at Simon Ashford. You know, she said clearly, my mother taught me a custom from the eastern valleys. A gift of wine is shared. She extended her cup back toward him. Drink first, sir, and honor the house. The hall had not noticed. The music played on. But Simon Ashford's smile developed a hairline crack. The honor is yours, lady, he tried. I insist, said Grace, and now her voice carried, bright and merry, and heads began to turn. It is terrible luck to refuse. Surely a trade envoy respects the customs of the valleys. Silence spread out from them in rings. Simon Ashford looked at the cup. Every soul at the surrounding tables looked at Simon Ashford looking at the cup. A drink he had poured himself, offered back, and a room slowly understanding why a man might hesitate. He bolted. He made it 4 steps. He did not meet a wall of guards, because the guards were still rising, confused. He met Adam, who had crossed the entire hall in the time it takes to drop a smile, and who now stood in his path with a stillness more frightening than any drawn blade. "The cup," Adam said, "was for the lady, so the explanation will be for me." They searched Ashford's quarters within the hour, and found the rest of it hidden in a false-bottomed trade chest, letters in a simple cipher that one of Hale's old campaigners cracked before midnight, payment records, and worst, a map of the Iron Ridge's hidden passes, half completed, meant for delivery at the spring thaw. But it was the last letter, unsent, that turned the war room to stone. Adam read it aloud, his voice flat and cold as the floor. "The woman is the key. The tie is confirmed, they move as one heart. Take her alive and unharmed, and the wolf will follow her collar anywhere. Lord Crane authorizes triple rates. Time is short. The pretender's support doubles by the week, and the Lord Regent's answer must come before the thaw. Prepare the Eastern Lodge to receive the guest." The words unharmed and guest, applied to Grace like labels on a crate, made something in Adam's face that even Edward Hale looked away from. "There is more," the old campaigner said reluctantly, holding the decoded pages. "The early letters, from weeks ago. This is how Crane learned the king survived it all. Ashford had a cousin riding with the search parties in the borderlands, but the tie, the bond, Ashford only confirmed that recently, from gossip inside these walls, meaning Crane has known where we are for some time," Adam finished quietly, "and has not attacked. Why does a man with 3 armies not attack?" Grace had been silent, staring at the map of the hidden passes. Now she spoke, and her voice was strange and distant, because the shape of the thing was assembling itself before her eyes, and it was worse than an army. "Because armies are loud," she said. "Attack the ridge and the whole kingdom sees a war, and wars can be lost. But take me quietly, in the night, with a cup of spiced wine, and there is no war at all." She looked up at Adam. "There is only a king who abandons his allies, walks alone into the south, and vanishes. Crane does not want to defeat you, Adam. Defeat makes martyrs. He wants you to erase yourself, and with me in his hands, you would do it. You told me so yourself in the shrine. Any trap on earth." No one in the war room spoke, because it was true, and every man present had just watched how far across a crowded hall the king could move, when one cup of wine rose toward her lips. Edward Hale broke the silence, heavy as rockfall. "There are deep sanctuaries in the northern ice where—" "No." The word came from Grace and Adam in the same instant, in the same tone, and the tie hummed between them, and they looked at each other, and held an entire argument in 4 seconds of silence, and finished it. "Crane believes the tie is a collar," Grace said to the room. "He thinks love is a leash, because for a man like him, it could only ever be a leash." She stepped to the great map table, took up a marker stone, and set it down in the south, on the capital itself. "So we will teach him what it actually is. He has spies, so we will feed his spies. He wants me to be the key to your defeat, Adam. Fine, let him keep believing it." She looked up, and there was nothing left in her face of the woman who lived quietly at the edge of a forest. "Let us build him a trap," she said, "with me in the middle of it." The war room erupted. Edward Hale objected for 10 straight minutes. Captains argued. Adam stood silent through all of it, his eyes on Grace, and through the tie she felt not fear from him, and not refusal, but a fierce, blazing, terrified pride. "You could simply be safe," he said to her at last, beneath the noise, for her alone. "The north, the ice halls, waited out." "I tried safe for 3 years," Grace answered. "It is another word for waiting to lose everything twice." Adam turned to the room, and it quieted. "The lady has given her counsel," said the Alpha King. "I have never yet regretted taking it. Sit down, Edward. We have a season of lies to design, and if we design them well, Victor Crane will spend the spring building his perfect trap, never once suspecting that every plank of it was cut to our measure." He looked down at the map, at the small stone standing alone on the capital. "And when it closes," he said softly, "it will close on him." Grace let herself be captured on the first morning of the thaw, and the hardest part was making it look like a mistake. The plan had taken all the last weeks of winter to build, through Simon Ashford, who had discovered a deep sudden enthusiasm for cooperation once Edward Hale explained his alternatives. The ridge fed Crane's network a careful story. The king and his lady had quarreled over strategy. The lady, headstrong, had insisted on traveling to the eastern packs herself to win their pledge, lightly guarded, against the king's wishes. The route, the timing, the size of her escort, all of it flowed south, in Ashford's own cipher, in Ashford's own hand, verified by Crane's remaining spies, who observed exactly what they had been positioned to observe. Every word was bait. The eastern journey was real, the quarrel was theater, and the escort of 6 was actually the 6 deadliest wolves the Iron Ridge had produced in a generation, under orders that had made even them go quiet. When the ambush comes, lose. It came at a river crossing on the 3rd morning, 40 gray cloaks against 6, and the 6 fought precisely well enough to be believable, and precisely poorly enough to be overwhelmed, scattering into the forest as planned, leaving Grace standing alone on the bank, with her heart slamming, and a ring of drawn steel closing around her. A lean man with colorless eyes walked his horse through the ring. Grace had never seen him, but she knew him at once, from Adam's descriptions, and from her own dream's worst guesses. "Lady Grace," said Marcus Vane, and inclined his head with genuine courtesy. "You have led me on the finest chase of my career. I mean that as high praise." He studied her face with those unsettling colorless eyes, and for one terrible moment she was certain he could read the whole plan written on her skin. Then he simply nodded. "Lord Crane guarantees your comfort and your safety. Whether the guarantee survives your choices is, as always, up to the guest." They rode south for 9 days, and through every one of those days, down the long invisible thread of the tie, Grace felt Adam. He was moving too, she knew, with the armies of the north swinging wide through the western passes, but through the tie came only steadiness, warmth, presence. "I am here. I am coming. Hold." She fell asleep in enemy camps, wrapped in an emotion that had no business surviving in a war, and its name was certainty. The capital rose out of the southern plains like a crown of stone, and the fortress at its heart swallowed her. Victor Crane received her in the map room. He was not what she expected. No sneering giant, no cruel theatrics. He was a neat, quiet, silver-haired man with tired, intelligent eyes, and he rose politely when she entered, and that ordinariness was the most frightening thing she had ever seen, because this mild, tidy person had erased her village with paperwork. "Lady Grace," he gestured to a chair. "Wine? No," he added, with the faintest dry humor. "Perhaps not wine, given events. Tea, then." They sat across a table older than the kingdom, while a servant poured, and Victor Crane studied her with those tired eyes, and then said the last thing she had prepared for. "Alder Creek." Grace's cup stopped an inch off its saucer. "I know who you are," Crane continued, mild as morning. "I have known since my trackers mapped your history. The healer's daughter. The lost village." He folded his hands. "I will not pretend the word regret means much from me at this table, but you deserve accuracy, so here it is. Alder Creek was the price of a road. The eastern trade route needed that valley. The kingdom's treasury was drowning, and 30 families stood where the survey lines ran. I sent men to move them. The men I sent exceeded every order I gave. I hanged their captain quietly the following spring, not for justice, you understand, but for sloppiness. And then I wrote a clean report and moved on, because the road was built and the treasury refilled, and that arithmetic is the actual, unpoetic truth of how kingdoms live." He leaned forward slightly. "I tell you this, Lady Grace, because you are an intelligent woman, and I need you to understand what you are actually dealing with. I am not a monster. Monsters are rare and inefficient. I am an administrator, and I took the throne from your Adam for the same reason I took your valley, because he was in the way of arithmetic. He was beloved and brave, and utterly asleep, signing whatever his council placed before him, while the kingdom rotted under his signature. Do you know how easy it was? I did not defeat a king. I inherited a vacancy." "And yet," Grace said, finding her voice level, "you have flooded the kingdom with soldiers to catch one sleeping man. Strange behavior toward a vacancy." Something moved behind Crane's tired eyes, the first honest flicker. "The man who went into that ravine was a vacancy," he agreed softly. "The man who came out of your cabin is something else. And I confess, lady, that this is your doing, and I find it professionally fascinating and personally inconvenient." He rose, walked to the great map wall, and touched the northern mountains. "He is coming. I feed his spies false garrison numbers, and his movements show me he does not believe them. I set the Eastern lords against him, and he wins them by pardoning their debts. Someone has taught the sleeping king to see. He turned. So we arrive at you. You will write him a letter, in your own words, telling him you are treated gently, and that the gentleness ends the hour his army crosses the river Alden. He will halt. Kings who love halt, and then he and I will negotiate a partition, like reasonable men, and no one else's village pays for anyone's pride. Arithmetic, Lady Grace. You of all people should value a solution without fire in the windows. And there it was, the trap within the trap, and it was elegant, and a younger Grace might even have believed it, because it was dressed head to toe as mercy. But Grace had spent a winter learning statecraft at a map table, and she heard what was missing. Partition meant time. Time meant Crane's new armies finishing their muster in the south. The letter was not a peace, it was a delay, and the river Alden was not a line, it was a leash. And the moment the southern muster was complete, the arithmetic would change again, the way it had changed for Alder Creek. So Grace lowered her eyes, let her shoulders round with a captive's defeat, and said, quietly, I will need time to find the words. Take the evening, Crane said, gently, already victorious. They always find the words. They gave her a fine locked room in the East Tower, and a maid named Ellen Price, a small quick-eyed woman who brought supper and lingered, folding linens that needed no folding, until the guard outside grew bored of the doorway. Then Ellen Price spoke, very low, without turning from the linens. 6 years I have served this fortress, my lady. Before that I served the old king's household, and before that I was born in a village called Marsh End, which sits on the eastern trade road. Her hands smoothed a pillow slip flat, the road that was paid for with a place called Alder Creek. Everyone below stairs knows what runs through these halls at night, and whose orders built which graves. She turned then, and her plain face was fierce. There are more of us in this fortress than there are of them, my lady. Cooks and grooms and clerks and maids. We have been waiting 6 years for arithmetic of our own. So, what do you need? Grace looked at this stranger, this gift, this ember of the kingdom Adam swore he would build, and felt the tie thrumming warm and southward strong, closer every day, and she almost laughed at the beautiful, terrible symmetry of it. Crane collected leverage. He had never once thought to count the people who carried his tea. Paper, Grace said. He wants a letter. He will get one. That night she wrote 2. The first, in tear-blotted ink, said everything Victor Crane wished the North to read, and she cried real tears onto it, which was easy. She simply thought of her mother at the window. The second letter was 4 lines long, written on a strip of linen, sewn into a laundry bundle, bound for the river washhouses, addressed to a fish merchant, who was a cousin of a groom, whose brother had married Iron Ridge, and it said what the tie was already whispering down its thread into Adam's dreaming mind, but in words a war council could act on. The muster completes in 20 days. The river line is a lie. The servants are with us. Come before the moon fills, and come to the eastern gate, for it will open from the inside. Adam Blackwood read his mate's tear-stained letter aloud to his full war council, and then he did the thing that made his captains believe, for one cold minute, that their king had broken. He agreed to Crane's terms. Send riders under a peace banner, he commanded. Tell the Lord Regent the army of the North halts at the river Alden. Tell him I accept negotiation and partition. Tell him I ask only for proof, each week, of the lady's well-being. The council chamber, a commandeered granary in the burned hills above the river, went silent as a tomb. Edward Hale rose slowly, his scarred face gray. Boy, he began, in a voice no one had used on the Alpha King in 20 years. If grief has taken your mind. Sit down, Edward, Adam said, and there was something in his tone, a low current of ferocious joy, that stopped the old Alpha mid-breath. Adam laid the tear-stained letter flat on the map table, and beside it he laid a thin strip of linen, still smelling faintly of river water and fish. 2 letters arrived this week, he said. Crane knows about one of them. He read the 4 linen lines aloud. The muster, the lie of the river, the servants, the eastern gate, and the granary war room watched the meaning bloom in one another's faces, like dawn, moving across a valley. She was never the captive, someone breathed. She is the vanguard, Adam said. Crane spent a season building a trap around the one truth he understood, that I would trade the world for her. He is correct, I would. What he cannot conceive, because in 40 years, he has never once trusted another living soul, is that she and I might build something together, that neither of us commands alone. He thinks the tie is a leash to pull me by. He has never imagined it could be a bridge with traffic moving both directions. He looked around the room, and the fire in him leapt to every face it touched. So here is the shape of it. For 20 days, we negotiate, slowly. Stupidly, we argue over the wording of clauses. We give his spies an army that sits and rusts by a river, and while the Lord Regent watches the north with growing satisfaction, the true army walks into his capital one servant, one cart, one fish barrel at a time. It took 18 of the 20 days, and it was the strangest campaign in the kingdom's history. Iron Ridge wolves entered the capital as grain haulers, and stone masons and pilgrims to the winter shrine. Weapons traveled in flour sacks and floated down river inside barrels of saltfish. Ellen Price's below-stairs kingdom mapped every corridor, every watch rotation, every officer who drank and everyone who did not, and the maps went out with the laundry and came north with the fish. Twice it nearly collapsed. A wagon was searched at the west gate, and the searching sergeant turned out to be Marsh End born, and looked at the sword hilts beneath the grain and called out, "Nothing here, move along." A young ridge wolf was recognized in a market by a southern veteran, and before the man could shout, 3 separate strangers spilled things on him, and in the chaos, the young wolf became a rumor. And every night, in the East Tower, Grace stood at her barred window, looked north, and poured everything she had learned down the tie, not words. The tie did not truly carry words over distance. It carried knowing. She would stand at the window and hold the watch rotations in her mind, the count of the muster, the mood of the fortress, the face of the officer who checked the eastern gate at midnight, and she would feel Adam receive it, the way you feel someone take the other end of a heavy table. 2 minds, 1 work. Crane visited her every 3rd day, always courteous, always watchful, and Grace performed her slow surrender so perfectly that she frightened herself. She argued at first, then bargained, then wept, then grew quiet, then began, with exquisite reluctance, to advise him. Small true things about the North that his spies could verify, each one costing nothing, each one buying belief. By the 2nd week, Victor Crane, connoisseur of leverage, collector of souls, had begun to relax in her presence. And one evening, over the tea she never drank first, he said, almost kindly, "You see now how it ends, lady. When the partition is signed, you will find I am not ungrateful to those who help arithmetic along." "I am learning how things end, my lord," Grace agreed, with downcast eyes, and through the tie, 90 miles north, she felt her mate's grim laughter like a hand squeezing hers. On the 19th day, the moon one night from full, Marcus Vane came to her tower room, alone, unannounced, and everything nearly ended. The tracker stood in her doorway with his colorless eyes, and turned his head slowly, tasting the room the way he had tasted her abandoned cabin, and Grace's blood went to ice, because Vane did not read letters or ciphers. Vane read people, and she had one heartbeat to become unreadable. "My Lord Vane." She did not rise from her chair by the window. "To what do I owe the honor?" "Sleeplessness," he said. He walked the room's edge, touching nothing, seeing everything. "Something is wrong in this fortress, lady." "Nothing I can report. The watches turn, the servants serve, the accounts balance. And yet for 3 nights I have walked these halls with my skin prickling, like the hour before lightning." He stopped at her window and looked north, exactly along the line of the tie, and Grace's heart forgot its rhythm. "I came here," he said softly, "because in all this stone maze, you are the only person whose presence makes sense to me, the captive, who ceased struggling too gracefully, the grieving woman who sleeps, my informants tell me, deeply and well." He turned those colorless eyes on her. "I hunt by asking one question, Lady Grace. Not where is my quarry, but what does my quarry love? So indulge a sleepless man. What do you love?" The room was absolutely still. Lie, and he would see it. He saw everything. Stay silent, and silence was confession. So Grace stood, crossed to the window beside him, looked north into the dark, and told the exact truth. "A man the world calls dead," she said. "A cabin that is ash by now, I expect. 30 families, who are one line of ink in this fortress's ledgers." She turned and met the colorless eyes without armor, without theater, letting him read every grain of it. "You hunt by finding what people love, my lord. It must be a strange life, carrying that lantern through the world, seeing everyone by its light, and standing in the dark yourself. What do you love, Marcus Vane? The silence stretched 5 heartbeats. 10. Something moved at the very bottom of the tracker's pale gaze. Some sediment stirred that had lain still for a very long time. I was 6 years old when Lord Crane's men took me from a burning village, he said at last, in a voice like a door opening on an empty room. He said I had a gift and gave it a use. I have never once asked what the villages did before they burned. His eyes returned north, to the dark. The prickling on my skin, lady. It is not coming from the north at all, is it? It is already inside these walls. Grace said nothing. The truth stood in the room with them like a third person. Marcus Vane looked at her for a long, long moment. Then he inclined his head, the same grave courtesy as at the river, and walked to the door, and paused. I am ordered to inspect the eastern gate watch tomorrow at midnight, he said, without turning. It occurs to me that I am very tired, and that a man cannot be blamed for what happens while he sleeps. He opened the door. Whatever you love, lady, he said quietly. I hope it is worth what it costs. In my experience, it so rarely is. The door closed. Grace stood alone, shaking, at the window, and let the whole encounter pour north down the tie, and felt Adam receive it, and felt his answer come back fierce and sure through 90 miles of darkness. Tomorrow night, then. The moon would rise full. The eastern gate would open from the inside. And the last thing Grace sent north, before she finally slept, was not tactics at all. It was simply this. The thing she had never yet said in words, sent instead as pure knowing, down the thread between their two hearts. Whatever happens tomorrow, finding you in the snow, was the one signature of mine I will never regret. The eastern gate opened at midnight, without a single blow struck, because the men guarding it had been fed, healed, and remembered by name for 6 years by the people below stairs. And when Ellen Price walked up to the watchpost carrying a lantern, and said simply, "It is time, boys," 4 of the 6 guards laid down their spears, and the other 2 were locked, unhurt and faintly relieved, in their own guardhouse. The army of the north came through the gate like a river finding an old channel, fast, silent, and everywhere at once. There was fighting. It would be a lie to say otherwise. Sharp and desperate in the fortress yards where Crane's loyal companies rallied, but it was fighting of a kind the Southern soldiers had never trained for, because the fortress itself had turned against them. Doors they needed were locked, doors they defended opened behind them. Armories stood mysteriously empty, alarm bells had lost their clappers, and the great chains of the inner portcullis had been quietly packed with grease and wool, so that when the captain screamed to drop them, they sank slow and gentle as snow, far too late to divide the wolves of the Iron Ridge. Grace heard it all from the east tower, and felt it through the tie, Adam moving through the fortress like a storm front, and she was working her own part of the plan, because her part was the reason the night would end in a throne room, instead of a graveyard. Down the servants' stairs with Ellen Price, through the under corridors, to the cells beneath the old keep, where 6 years of Crane's arithmetic had filed away every lord, officer, and clerk who had asked inconvenient questions. The cellar keys had been copied weeks ago from wax pressings. Door after door swung open, and blinking, gray-faced men and women stepped out, the kingdom's stubborn remnant, and among them, leaning on the doorframe of the deepest cell, stood an old woman, with iron eyes, whom Ellen Price bowed to, and whom Grace recognized from a portrait in the burned histories. Lady Margaret Ashworth. The old king's chief judge, declared dead of winter fever 6 years ago. The same week her court had demanded an audit of the Eastern Road. "So," said the old judge, looking Grace up and down, "you are the healer the walls have been whispering about." She flexed her ink-stained hands as if reaching for a gavel. "I am told there is arithmetic that wants checking. Take me upstairs." The last of Crane's companies surrendered in the great yard as the moon reached its height, and the fortress went strangely, ringingly quiet, and every road of the night led at last to the throne room. Victor Crane stood alone before the throne he had taken. He had not fled, and he had not armed himself. He stood in his neat gray coat with his hands folded, tired eyes taking in the tide filling his hall, northern wolves, freed prisoners, and his own servants, cooks and grooms and maids arraying themselves along the walls not as staff, but as witnesses. When Adam Blackwood came through the great doors with Grace at his side, Crane actually nodded, one administrator acknowledging another's completed work. Remarkable, he said. I ran the numbers 100 ways. Your army sat by the river in every one of them. He looked at Grace, and understanding, aged his face by years. The letter, the weeping, the slow surrender, all of it composed. I sat across a table from you a dozen evenings, and audited your grief, and it balanced perfectly. His tired eyes went briefly, almost wonderingly, to the servants along the walls, and the fortress itself. I held every lord and lever in this kingdom, and I was defeated by the laundry. You were defeated, Adam said, by everyone your arithmetic rounded away. He did not raise his voice, and it carried to the last row anyway. The whole hall waited for the blow, for the roar, for the king's justice, red and immediate, and half the wolves in the room hungered for it. Instead, Adam turned his back on Victor Crane and addressed the hall. 6 years ago this man began stealing a kingdom, and the theft succeeded because it looked like paperwork. So his fall will not look like fury. It will look like the thing he feared enough to bury alive. He gestured, and through the crowd, on Ellen Price's arm, came Lady Margaret Ashworth, and at the sight of her, for the first time in that entire long night, Victor Crane's composure cracked, his folded hands tightening white. Open court, Adam said. Full records, public testimony, every ledger unsealed. Alder Creek first. He looked at Grace as he said the name, and she stood very straight, and did not cry. Then Marsh End, then the coup, then every line of ink between. Not because mercy is owed, but because this kingdom has 6 years of truth to eat, and it will eat at a lit table, with everyone watching, so that no man for 100 years can whisper that it was all merely the victor's story. The trial lasted 11 days, and it was the strangest spectacle in the kingdom's memory. The fortress gates thrown open, farmers and fishwives packed into the galleries beside northern alphas, old Judge Ashworth presiding with her iron eyes and her recovered gavel, while clerks read ledgers aloud into ringing silence. Grace testified on the third day. She told the whole hall about the window her mother pushed her through, and about the fire in every window behind her, and about the single line of ink, and when she finished, the silence in that room was a kind of monument. Crane's surviving captains testified against him in exchange for their lives. The hanged captain's quiet execution surfaced from the records. Even Marcus Vane appeared, gray and composed, gave his testimony in a voice like an empty room, refused all offers of leniency, and asked the court for only one thing, the name of the village he had been taken from at 6 years old, so that he would know, finally, what he was before he was a lantern. On the 11th day, Margaret Ashworth read the verdict, and it surprised no one, and the sentence surprised everyone. Not the block, the ledgers. Victor Crane was stripped of every title, every holding, every coin, and condemned to spend his remaining years in a plain clerk's cell, doing the one thing he did honestly, accounting, working through the records of his own regime, calculating and documenting restitution for every family his arithmetic had touched, each page reviewed and countersigned, forever, by survivors. The treasury of his seized estates would fund every payment. He asked to serve the block instead, they said. The court declined. Kingdoms live by arithmetic, Judge Ashworth told him, in the sentence's final words. So the kingdom will now spend your life correcting yours. That evening, when the hall had finally emptied, Adam found Grace standing alone before the throne, looking up at it, and he came and stood beside her, and for a while neither spoke. Edward Hale wants the coronation within the month, Adam said at last. The council wants it in the capital, with all 7 territories in attendance, gold everywhere, 3 days of feasting. He paused. I told them no. Grace turned. No? I told them, Adam said, that I would be crowned in the spring, in the north, at the edge of a particular forest, by a particular creek, in front of anyone who cares to walk that far. And that the crown would go on second. He took both her hands, and through the tie flowed everything the words were about to attempt. Because there is an older ceremony that comes first, if a certain stubborn healer, who once threatened the Alpha King with a wooden spoon, is willing to make the arrangement permanent. Grace looked down at their joined hands, then up at the golden eyes she had first seen in bloody snow, and the smile started somewhere in the center of her, and reached her face last. I will need to check my schedule, she said. Spring is a very busy season for herbs. Grace. Yes, she said, laughing and crying at once, exactly as she had in the ruined shrine. Yes, obviously, Yes. On one condition. She lifted her chin toward the great gold throne looming above them. That thing stays here. I am not having it in the north. It would frighten the fox. The Alpha King of the Seven Territories looked up at his ancestral throne, and then at his mate, and agreed to her terms without negotiation, which, as Edward Hale would grumble at the wedding, told the whole kingdom exactly who had truly won the war. Spring came late to the borderlands that year, and when it finally arrived, it found the impossible already in progress, the entire kingdom walking north. They came for weeks, along the creek road that had once carried only exiles and soldiers, lords of the Seven Territories in their traveling clothes, Iron Ridge wolves singing marching songs, freed clerks and old judges, fishwives from the capital who had hidden sword hilts under salt, Ellen Price, at the head of a below-stairs delegation 200 strong, and the entire village by the forest's edge, with old Ben Hartley and little Tom, now 9 and insufferably proud, telling anyone who would listen that he had personally carried bread to the king before anyone knew there was a king. The wedding was held first, as promised, in the clearing, where a woman had once found a dying wolf in the snow. There were no walls, no gold, no throne. There was a rebuilt cabin in the hollow between the two hills. Adam had rebuilt it himself through the spring, with his own hands, and Edward Hale's endless unsolicited advice. And there was the flat stone by the creek fork, where the bread had once been left, which served, at Grace's insistence, as the altar. Judge Margaret Ashworth performed the joining, because Grace had asked her, saying that a woman who had spent 6 years buried for the truth ought to be the one to speak the truest words, and the old judge, who never wept, kept having to pause and glare at the treetops. Grace wore no crown, and carried winter root flowers, pale and silver-leaved, the plant she had been digging for, on the day the mountain fell on them. Adam, when the moment came to speak his vows before the Seven Territories, abandoned the words the heralds had prepared, and said instead, in the plain voice of the man, rather than the king, I was dead in the snow, and you argued with me until I lived. Everything I am now was built in your kitchen. I do not promise you a kingdom, kingdoms come and go. I have misplaced one myself. I promise you the thing you actually asked for. One safe cabin, at the edge of one quiet forest, for the rest of our lives, and me in it. And Grace, who had planned several sentences, managed only, you were the worst patient I ever had, and I am keeping you forever, before the tie overflowed, and made words pointless, and the Seven Territories witnessed their future queen laughing and crying at once, and roared their approval until snow slid off the pines. The coronation followed at sunset and lasted 4 minutes, which the heralds declared a historical scandal, and everyone else declared perfect. Adam knelt on the flat stone, and Edward Hale set the plain iron circlet of the north on his head, the old crown of the first kings, the gold one having been left in the south to gather dust exactly as Grace had ordered. And then Adam rose and did the thing that no herald had planned, and no history had precedent for. He took a second circlet, iron braided with silver in the pattern of winter root leaves, and turned to Grace, and the clearing went utterly silent. Not a consort's coronet, Adam said, so every territory could hear it. A crown, whole and equal. The kingdom nearly ended because it sat on one head and trusted one signature. It will not make that mistake twice. His golden eyes found hers. She held the door when the soldiers came. She walked into the trap and turned it inside out. She has already been ruling for a year. Everyone here has simply been too polite to mention it. So Grace Miller of Alder Creek, who had been one line of ink in a dead man's ledger, was crowned at a creek stone at the edge of the world, and the first act of the 2 crowned heads of the 7 territories was to declare the borderlands a full territory of their own, the 8th, with a seat at every council, so that no map would ever again have an edge where people could be dumped and forgotten. The years that followed filled the histories, and the histories, for once, made good reading. The open courts spread from the capital to every territory, and lords learned to dread the sound of Margaret Ashworth's traveling gavel. The restitution ledgers of Victor Crane, produced line by line in a plain cell, rebuilt Marsh End and 40 villages like it, and if anyone asked the old clerk whether the work was punishment or penance, he answered only that the arithmetic, at last, balanced. Marcus Vane found his village's name in the records, walked there alone, stood a long time in a field where nothing remained, and then came north and asked the crowns for work suited to his lantern. He spent the rest of his life finding the lost, stolen children, vanished travelers, the erased, and it was said he never failed, and never smiled, except once, at a reunion, in a fishing town, briefly, when he thought no one saw. Ellen Price ran the 8th Territory's first council house. Tom Hartley grew up to captain the Creek Road Patrol, and the Fox, or more likely the Fox's granddaughter, went right on raiding the woodshed every autumn, taxed and tolerated as a founding citizen. And the king and queen of the 8 territories governed from the north half of every year, from a stone hall built in the village, close enough to the cabin that they could walk home for supper. Because they did walk home, that was the thing the kingdom never stopped marveling at. The most powerful couple in the known world could be found on summer evenings, arguing about herb beds in a cabin garden, and petitioners learned that the surest way to an audience was not through heralds, but through showing up at the fence around supper time, preferably with a problem and a respect for the tomatoes. On the 10th anniversary of the night everything began, the first snow came early, and Grace stood at the cabin window watching it fall, and felt her husband come up the creek path before she could possibly have heard him, his heartbeat arriving under hers the way it had every hour of every day for 10 years. He came in stamping snow, older, grayer at the temples, iron circlets stuffed carelessly in a coat pocket, carrying firewood, and their daughter, 6 years old with her mother's stubbornness and her father's golden eyes, launched herself at him, from the top of the stairs with total confidence that he would catch her, and was caught. Later, when the child slept and the fire burned low, Adam stood at the window beside Grace, and together they looked out at the snow filling up the clearing, the same snow. 10 years tonight, he said. I have been thinking about it all day. Everything that had to go wrong for it to go right. The poison, the ravine, the cold. If they had thrown me anywhere else. If you had cut your firewood one valley over. If you had been sensible, even once, and run. Grace leaned her head against his shoulder and watched the snow come down on the place where she had knelt beside a dying wolf and made the choice that unmade a tyrant and remade a kingdom. My mother used to say something, she said, about why healers exist. She said the world breaks constantly, everywhere, all the time, and it cannot be stopped, and that is not our business. Our business is smaller. Our business is that when something broken lands in front of you, you kneel down. That is the whole trade, she said. Kneel down and begin. The fire settled. Out in the dark, far off, a wolf sang somewhere along the ridge, one of the free packs of the 8th Territory, and the sound carried over the cabin, over the sleeping village, over the whole vast breathing kingdom that existed because one exiled woman had 10 seconds to decide and knelt down in the snow. I never asked you, Adam said softly. That first night, I opened my eyes, and there was a stranger pressing her hands against the worst of it, in the dark, in the cold, with hunters blowing horns on the ridge. 10 years, and I never asked what you were thinking. Grace smiled at their reflection in the window glass, the healer and the wolf, the queen and the king, the two halves of one long, stubborn heartbeat. I was thinking, she said, that you were far too heavy, and I was going to save you anyway. And outside, soft and endless and no longer hiding anything at all, the snow went on falling.